Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's forum on the internationalization of higher education. My name is Dr. Mousumi Mukherjee, and I'm the Deputy Director of the International Institute for Higher Education Research and Capacity Building at OP Jindal Global University. This is the sixth forum as part of the Australia-India Education Researcher Forums series facilitated by the Australia-India Institute. These online forums provide a platform to showcase research in education disciplines and from both nations and explore opportunities for new research collaborations. In today's webinar, researchers from India and Australia will unpack the landscape of institutional as well as overarching bilateral strategies for the internationalization of education in India and Australia. This session will examine the main drivers of successful international engagement, opportunities, two-way benefits, and challenges associated with formalizing partnerships, implementing academic mobility, and internationalizing curriculum. Researchers from both countries will share insights and best practices on how to pursue internationalization with a focus on ensuring equitable and inclusive outcomes. I'll introduce our panel speakers shortly, but first, as a moderator for today's forum, I would also like to share a little more about my own research focus. I'm currently working on a project funded by the Indian Council for Social Science Research, along with two collaborators, one from India, Dr. Shekhar Tokus from Ambedkar University, and Dr. Vanessa Fernandez from Monash University, Australia. We are studying motivations and experiences of international students within the Indian context. Now to our panel discussion, I would like to introduce you to our expert speakers, Professor Anita Patankar. She's the director of the Symbiosis Center for International Education and founding director of the Symbiosis School of Liberal Arts, India's first full liberal arts college, where she now holds the position of advisor. She has been actively engaged in the Indian higher education space for more than 38 years, currently responsible for internationalization across Symbiosis International University. She has developed competencies for inclusive and innovative learning processes, nurturing a deep acceptance of the long-term benefits of internationalization at home, and a commitment to the creation of fair and just learning ecosystems. Our next speaker is Professor N.B. Varghese. He is currently Distinguished Visiting Professor at the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay, or Mumbai, former Vice Chancellor of National Institute of Educational Planning and Administration, New Delhi, and founding director of Center for Policy Research in Higher Education, and former head of governance and management at the IIEP UNESCO Paris. Our third speaker is Professor Betty Leask, and she is Emeritus Professor in the School of Education at La Trobe University, Australia, and Chief Editor of the Journal of Studies in International Education. Betty has published on a broad range of theoretical and practical international education topics, but is best known for her work on internationalization of the curriculum, teaching, and learning. Our fourth speaker is Professor Craig Whitsitt, and he is a course coordination. He's responsible for course coordination of the Higher Education Innovative Learning and Teaching Postgraduate Certificate program at Curtin University. He's Associate Professor at the School of Education at Curtin, and he is best known for his research and work related to curriculum internationalization and academic staff engagement. At the conclusion of this panel discussion, of course, there'll be opportunity for Q&A with our panelists. So those of you who are audience out there, please type your questions for our panel, for our esteemed panelists in the Q&A chat box provided. Now we move to the main session panel discussion session. And here I would really request all our esteemed panelists to briefly introduce themselves, though I have introduced them, but if they could share a little bit about their background in international higher education a little more for our audience, and share their thoughts on the topic of today's discussion in general briefly, beginning with Dr. Patankar, the kind of work that she is doing at Symbiosis International University. Over to you, Dr. Patankar.
Thank you, Professor Mousumi. Extremely happy to be here. I think my engagement with internationalization of higher education began formally, I suppose, around 2000, in the year 2000, when Symbiosis was thinking of starting a liberal arts program. And during those days, I spent a lot of time with my team thinking about and studying international models for education, teaching, learning, assessment, evaluation, student experience. And then, luckily, because we were setting up India's first program, also engaging with foreign universities, because they were very keen on our program. It was India's first, and therefore a lot of collaborations and mobility, especially from American liberal arts universities, was some things that I worked on in that first decade. Around 2000 and I think 11, Asia also started paying a lot of attention to new ways of teaching and learning, creating co-constructed democratic learning spaces for students. And therefore, I was lucky to work with universities from Asia, and we set up the Alliance for Asian Liberal Arts Universities. Of course, in my recent avatar, in the last 8 years or so, I have been working with institutes across Symbiosis, looking at internationalization. And a one-size-fits-all doesn't work. So therefore, it's been very enlightening for me. I learn as well as hand-holding institutions. And now, of course, with the NEP, which we will talk about a little later, lots of opportunities to create programs, to look at ways in which internationalization, global citizenship, along with India's own challenges within its domestic student community. So that's basically where my work has been.
Thank you, Dr. Patankar. Professor Varghese.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mousumi. I have been working in the area of internationalization. This work started while I was at the International Institute of Educational Planning, UNESCO Paris. Since I was working in an international organization, I was more at ease with the trends and patterns of the global mobility of students, teachers, institutions, and programs. That used to be my pattern. After coming back to India and setting up the Center for Policy Research in Higher Education in India, I shifted more towards India and how the Indian students are performing, how they are moving out. Or in other words, what I mean to say is that mobility is one of the major concerns, and the different aspects of mobility I have focused on, especially when Professor Betty is here. I will not say that I work on curriculum related to issues, international curriculum, etc. She's an expert in this area. That is what I am doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Varghese. Over to you, Professor Betty Les.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to everyone for joining and for the organisers for getting this together. I've been working in international higher education for around 33 years. I was, prior to that, working as a secondary school teacher, so I have a background in education in the secondary sector, but also transitioning into higher education those years ago, and that transition was really focused on teaching international students initially, but then became focused on how do we transfer the benefits of having international students in our classrooms to domestic Australian students who perhaps can't undertake mobility programs. And so my initial work in the field was to work with other academic staff, program designers, and also leaders of the institution to help them to understand how they might work to bring the benefits of an internationalized higher education to all students. So that led me into the work that I did as part of an Australian Teaching and Learning Fellowship to develop a framework of internationalisation of the curriculum so that people could understand its potential and how to go about providing teaching and learning activities and programs that would assist all students to live in a very super complex, connected world as graduates and as professionals and citizens. So that's a little bit about my background. I think that, I will say that once I went from that kind of working at what I called the coalface of international higher education, I also went into working in management. So I worked as a Pro-Vice Chancellor, teaching and learning, and I worked as a DVC academic, where I had responsibility for the international office as well as for the entire teaching and learning program across a university. I think that was also a valuable contrast to the work that I'd done earlier, and certainly taught me a lot about the macro and the micro of the sort of work that needs to be done.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Betty. Next, I would like to invite Professor Craig Whitsitt.
Like Betty, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with you and engage in this conversation. I have a somewhat similar background to Betty in that I started life in a school of education and did a teaching degree, taught in high schools in Australia and taught in high school in the UK. My interest in internationalisation in higher education came about through my experience working as a foreign national in Japan in the Japanese university sector, and at a time when they were just introducing the concept of kopsaika or internationalisation. At that stage, they had fewer than 30,000 students in, and so they had started to develop a plan to have 100,000 international students studying in Japanese universities, and then they developed other programs and plans to expand on that number. So I was really interested in looking at, well, what is the experience of foreign, these were English language teachers, because part of the program for internationalising the system in Japan was around English and teaching English and making sure that people were prepared to be able to engage in a global workforce through English, and at the same time to preserve their cultural identity and how they perceive their uniqueness in the world. So that created some pretty interesting tensions, and my PhD work centred on that, and then that started my journey into internationalisation of the curriculum. And over the years now, I've worked quite closely with Betty's, whose work, that initial work she was talking about, around how do you internationalise curriculum, informed some work that I did with a colleague, Dr. Wendy Green, and then it's kind of taken a life of its own. So at the moment, I've been involved in some research and work in collaboration with colleagues in Brazil and South America, funded by the Australian government through DFAT, where we've looked at how can we internationalise the curriculum in the Latin American context, and how we might make that context specific rather than simply just adopting a model from a Western context and superimposing it in a very different cultural environment. So that's the kind of work that I'm doing at the moment. And again, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. At this stage, I think it would be good to hear from Professor Varghese a little bit about academic mobility of faculty and students between India and Australia, since this forum is being hosted by the Australia-India Institute. And Professor Varghese based on your expertise in studying mobility, if you can shed a little bit of your, shed some light on this. What is the current status of academic mobility and how it impacts the sending and the receiving country with regards to India and Australia?
Very much. I will talk about mobility. I think it is important to see that cross-border mobility is one of the important dimensions of internationalization of higher education. What is also important is the fact that if you take, for example, student mobility, it accounts for only 2% of the total global students. But still, in the discussions on internationalization, it takes a major share of the time, and also because of the factors involved in the process. Why I'm making this point is that previously internationalization of education or student mobility was not mediated by the market. Today, it is a revenue generation function has become very important in the context of globalization, especially if you say that today there are more than 6.5 million mobile students in the world globally, and a large share of these students, 7 countries account for nearly 60% of this global mobility. And recently there is a diversification that has taken place, and as a result of that, around 40 countries account for more than 65% of the mobility, student mobility. What is also equally important is the fact that United States, UK, Australia, and Canada, perhaps in that order, are playing important roles in that. And if you see the money that is generated, income that is generated, for United States, it is nearly around 35 billion US dollars, whereas it is around 33 billion dollars for Australia, the Australian dollars, So it's a huge amount of money, the market mediated process that is taking place. Now, it is also important to see that in Australia hosts, if you go by different data sets, what one finds is that some data sets include short duration stay, some only long duration. It's around, some estimates say that Australia hosts more than 630,000 students. Some estimates show that it's around 500,000. The difference is the estimates based on full-time students, long duration students, and short duration students. Especially in the TVET section, you find that there are quite a large number of short duration students. And what is important to notice is that out of this, a good share of students is also from the school education. Higher education accounts for more than 60% of the total student flow to Australia. And China accounts for basically, globally, China accounts for 17.5% of the students. But to Australia, China accounts for more than 28% of the students, and India accounts for more than 18%. India and China put together comes to around 58% of the students coming to this. And if you add Nepal, another 13%, which means that more than 70% of the student flow to Australia are coming from these 3 countries. It's very important because Australia has emerged as a favorable destination for these countries because of the good quality universities and their ranking. There are several universities, out of the 40 universities, several universities are ranked very high within the first 100 global ranking. 2, employment opportunities are better. 3, although it is a market mediated process, what one also finds is that perhaps the fee levels and stay costs are lower in Australia when compared to other places like UK and United States. And also the student loans are easily available in India. That is also one of the factors for faster flow to Australia, because what you find is that basically the loans that you get from India can afford, a student can afford almost completely a study for 1 year in Australia, but the same amount will be totally insufficient to continue and pursue the studies. So I think it is important also to see that the other dimension of mobility is the institutional mobility. You find that there are selected number of institutions from Australia, Monash University is one of the very good examples, which are highly mobile and established both in Africa, in Asia, and many other countries. So that is very important to see that. But that is a phenomenon of this century. Institutional mobility is it's a pattern of this century. And if you take program mobility, is a pattern that we see in the last decade, where I don't think that Australia is the playing a lead role. It is the MOOCs, which is United States has the largest number of enrollment, followed by India. In all these cases, the mobility, one pattern that one has to notice is that the mobility in mostly the student mobility is from developing countries to the developed countries. Institutional mobility is from the developed countries to the developing countries. Faculty mobility is mostly from the developing countries to the developed countries. In few instances, from the developed country, there may be instances. And the program mobility is from the developed countries to the developing countries. I'll end by saying that one unique feature, which is not questioned, is that money flow is from developing to the developed country, even though other forms of mobility are diversified from developing to the developed or developed to the developing. Money flow is unidirectional, and it is from the developing to the developed countries. And student flow is one of the dimensions. And many universities, including the universities in Australia, depend heavily on student fees from the international students. And in some of the cases, it accounts for nearly 36 to 40% of the annual budgets of the universities. So that is one of the reasons why student mobility becomes important. I'll end by stating that recently, India never permitted institutional mobility. Recently, in the new education policy, this was permitted. One of the first universities to start a branch campus in India is the Deccan University, and it is in the gift city in the state of Gujarat, in Ahmedabad, the capital city of Gujarat, in Ahmedabad. It is going to start. I'll stop here, Dr. Mousumi.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Varghese, for shedding light on student mobility, faculty mobility, and also institutional mobility in the 21st century. Talking about mobility and also some of the issues that you raised with regards to even the financial flow that is happening through this mobility, particularly mobility of students from developing to developed world context. There are a few exceptions in terms of institutions. As we all know, we have Dr. Anita Patankar from Symbiosis International, a university within the Indian context that has been receiving a lot of international students, even coming from outside of India since the 1980s, as I understand, Dr. Patankar, when by and large the larger higher education system had been mostly inward looking. So Dr. Patankar, could you please highlight some of the opportunities and challenges of internationalization within the larger Indian context, and with regards to your own work at Symbiosis International, what were the hurdles, what were the difficulties, particularly facilitating student mobility, facilitating students from outside of India to come to India? And also sending your own students out for short-term programs or other programs. Over to you, Dr. Patankar.
Thank you. Let me just continue with what Professor Varghese said, is that while we have been receiving Symbiosis, as you know, was set up for international students, we have been receiving full-time degree students. They have primarily come from certain regions. They have come from, are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
They have been coming from Africa, they've been coming from Asia, they've been coming from West Asia. They have been coming from these countries. From the developed countries, we have been getting students who come in for shorter term programs. That means 1 semester or 2 semesters. From Australia, for example, in the past, I think 5 years, but especially after the pandemic, we've seen a large number of Australian students who come in for summer schools, winter schools, work integrated learning, is something that I think India offers great opportunities for. So our challenges have been in managing and balancing these. So while our degree programs attract a large number of students who come from the developing world, and those challenges are very different because many of them come in from non-English speaking, so therefore our English foundation programs have become very popular. The short-term programs, the semester exchange, have attracted students from USA, UK, Europe, Australia, etc. I think one of the biggest challenges for us is the curriculum design and managing this, because at one time, in one space, in one classroom, you have Indian students, you have a large number of foreign students who come in from the developing world, and then you have students who come in for a semester. And I think that is something that we've been able to manage with a large focus on teacher training, learning interventions, a lot of foundational programs. So teacher training, I think, has been responsible for that. I think in the past few years, if I could just quickly mention a shift that I see in mobility, is that Australia is now, I think India and Australia have decided that we are going to be each other's flavor of the, not of the month, but of the year probably. I think at the highest levels of both countries, we've decided that we would like to partner with each other. There is, of course, geopolitical reasons for that. There are economic reasons for that. I think one of the biggest challenges that we face is how do we manage, for example, dual programs, joint programs. What Professor Varghese said is very true, is that there's a money flow and then there's a student flow. For example, the minute Australia offers or UK restored, post-study work rights, immediately that country becomes very attractive for Indian students. And that is our job as well, to make sure that, our students have bright futures. This whole challenge of managing excellence, repositioning Indian higher education sector as not just a country with a few, rare sporadic islands of excellence. But so in terms of that repositioning, I think the NEP does a good job of giving a kickstart there, but also of, letting go. I think learning to compete and cooperate with our partners is something that is a challenge and that we are learning right now. I think we've gotten over. I think this is a new India and a new Indian higher educational setup, that we're not paranoid of brain drain anymore. We're not looking only at, oh my God, we're losing our best students, why should we enter into a 2+2 dual? I think we're looking at what can we learn from each other. And I think this is also a new identity. I think we're a little more sure of who we are now and what we have to offer our partners, our international partners, and what we have. So at Symbiosis, I think that this is a challenge that through the pandemic, we were able to manage. I think the pandemic, in a way, had a few benefits, despite the overarching losses that we suffered. And one of the things I think was, our understanding of our digital competence, of our domain competence, of the fact that we could work as equals, with international partners. And I see the benefits of that. We have some very close relationships, as your university has, with a few. And I think Indian sector has also decided we don't want to dance with everybody at the party. Carefully selected and curated relationships, and then we become, deep at those. But I think this new revenue models, especially with duals, semester exchanges, there are more students. I have to be honest, there are more students who go on a global immersion program to the developed world than the number that comes in. So if we have, let's say, 480 students who go on a semester exchange to many of our partners, we might have only 300 coming in. So those are things that we've had to figure out. But I think the focus that diversity, internationalization, globalization, that these are skills our students desperately need. And I think that is what we keep at the forefront of our focus.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Patankar. And you mentioned about your university's relationship with Australia and receiving a lot of Australian students. We also receive a lot of Australian students at Jindal Global University. In fact, we have a Center for India-Australia Studies over here. I'm personally a fellow of the center. And through the center, we have received a lot of international students over the past a few years, even prior to the pandemic. And these students are all coming from different Australian universities under the new Colombo plan. And right now also, we are supposed to also, outside of the Colombo plan, group of Australian students are supposed to come later this semester from Monash University. And our public policy school is going to host this cohort of students. So thank you for highlighting our growing relationship with Australia and the mutual exchanges that we are having with regards to student mobility. But talking about some of the challenges, what you highlighted, Dr. Patankar, that actually is a good leeway to ask our Australian colleagues who are who are experts in internationalizing the curriculum and internationalization at home. You highlighted, that some of the challenges, where students are coming from diverse backgrounds, international background. How do you create curriculum that addresses the needs of these diversity of students in the classroom? So in this context, taking into consideration that physical mobility of both students and faculty is a privilege also, internationalizing the curriculum also benefits the larger cohort of students, the domestic students also, right? So in this context, I would really like to, really like to hear from Betty Lisk and then Craig Whitsett. What are the strategies that Australia is adopting for access and equity with regards to international higher education, and how access and equity agenda can be taken forward with internationalization at home for intercultural learning and global citizenship. Over to you, Betty, if you would shed some light on it.
Thank you. So first, I think it's important to understand what we're talking about when we say access and equity, because I think in the Australian context, some of those terms are quite specifically interpreted. But I think that we're talking in more general terms about access and equity rather than talking in broader terms. So I'm going to talk about how we might make the opportunities of an internationalized curriculum possible for all students to have some access to that, because they'll all be living in a globalized, super complex world, and although they're living maybe in the local context, and maybe they'll never move out of that local context, that context is itself part of that globalized environment. So I think it's important then to make a couple of points about how we might go about doing that, because I think that we often have made it, there are still many assumptions about the fact that if we bring in many international students, that we will automatically internationalize the experience for the domestic student. And we've seen in the past times when that has really come unstuck for us, where we've found that that's not the case, because perhaps those challenges that were mentioned earlier by Dr. Patankar are very real in all classrooms. How do you deal with diversity? How do you make sure every student not only has a voice in the classroom, but is able to take away from that learning experience something new and relevant to themselves when they all bring different resources in? So they're coming from different backgrounds. They not only have language issues to deal with, they've got a range of other cultural issues about how teaching and learning takes place in that environment. So a lot of my work has been on how do we work with teaching staff, with course designers who often are academic professors, very skilled in their disciplines, but perhaps with no training in education. and in how to teach and in how to design a course or a program that will develop all students' international and intercultural perspectives. Perhaps they're not even themselves sure about what international and intercultural perspectives actually mean in their disciplinary context, in their environment. So in terms of what they need to do, that is one of the challenges, I think. And again, we see the alignment with what Dr. Patika was saying around the importance of working with faculty members and teachers. And they're often different people designing the courses to teaching the courses, etc. So what I found in my work that one of the most important ways of addressing access and equity is to have those conversations around what does internationalisation mean for every different type of student you've got in the classroom. What does it mean also in the context of your own discipline? So for some areas, and I'll just finish because I know that I need to be a little brief. I want to finish by saying that the work that I did at the University of South Australia when I was working in the Faculty of Business was really focused on how do we give international students a voice, how do we work with domestic students to invite international students into their learning space and to interact with them rather than sitting back. But when I worked in the journalism program in another university, on the eastern seaboard, they didn't have a lot of international students. So their focus on internationalising the curriculum and access and equity was about how could they bring in ideas about journalism and about what it is to be a journalist in different parts of the world. How could they disrupt the dominant paradigm of internationalisation of the curriculum as it was understood by students and colleagues in their institution? That is, how do we get more international students into the journalism program? So the starting point for these people in different faculties, in different departments, can be very different because the resources they're working with, the challenges they're facing are very different. And I think that highlights one of the major problems we have more broadly in the sector, and that is how do we support the professional learning of the professors and the teachers that run the system, that are in the classrooms? How do we provide them with the support they need for the professional learning that they need? And that, I think, is an ongoing issue that we would do well to work together on. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you so much, Betty, for bringing this conversation to us, to think about not just curriculum internationalization, because curriculum internationalization will not be able to do what it needs to do without professional learning and faculty development. So thank you for raising this aspect of this issue. At this stage, I would now like to invite Professor Craig Whitsitt. If you could shed a little more, since you yourself have had a professional experience of working in Japan as an English teacher, as you mentioned, and some of your own early research coming out of your own experience as an international faculty. If you could shed some more light on this issue of faculty professional development and professional learning going hand in hand with internationalization of curriculum. Over to you, Craig.
Oh, thank you. I guess out of the Japan experience, one of the things that I really learned, and I think it's really relevant in the context of internationalization in higher education, is the capacity to unlearn. So whilst I was in Japan, I had to unlearn a lot of things I was taught here in Australia, unlearn a lot of the assumptions I assumed were just standard everywhere around the world. And that process of unlearning is something that I don't think we necessarily address. We talk about, intercultural communication and so on. We talk about international perspective, but some of these other more complex ideas aren't necessarily brought to the foreground in learning and teaching related issues. So the curriculum, and I'm using the curriculum rather broadly here in terms of learning and teaching, but also to capture that notion of, well, what is it that we're actually teaching? And Betty's work has highlighted, the importance of looking at what you teach in the formal curriculum, what you teach in the informal curriculum through these programs, mobility programs, short term. And what you teach is also what is reinforced, by the way. So, and then the hidden curriculum. So I always found it fascinating that Japanese students, when traveling to Australia, would still use the word for foreigners they use in Japan. So when they're talking about foreigners in Japan, the word is gaijin. So, watashi wa gaijin desu, I'm a foreigner in Japan, and that's quite okay. All right. Wariwara Nihonjin. Yes, we're Japanese, when they came to Australia, those students still referred to the Australians as gaijin. Right? So they hadn't made a mind shift to they're actually now the foreigner. Right? They're still taking their, Nihon-centric worldview with them. And that process of unlearning is challenging. And I think, something like I say that we could foreground a little more. In preparation for this forum today, I thought I'd just have a quick look at the Australian Strategy for International Education. And it's setting priorities for the next 10 years, 2021 to 2030. And talking about flows. So yes, the influx of students from China, the influx of students from India and Nepal is very, very significant. And there was a hard lesson learned around putting all your eggs in one basket, to use that phrase, when student flows suddenly stopped. So many institutions were suddenly, who were really dependent on the revenue created by the inflow of international students, forced to make some pretty hard decisions around how they're going to manage revenue, which resulted in increased workloads for academic staff who remained, and a significant number of job losses through the casualisation process that Australia has. We have a highly casualised workforce in our universities. So there are four priorities in this strategy. One is diversification. So to diversify the flow into Australia, or the market, and that would also be to diversify where we aim to export as well our product, whatever you want to call that. Then the main priority or strategy really around internationalisation is around meeting Australia's skills needs. So diversify the market, address the skills need, and then we have students at the centre. And it's very interesting to look at what does that actually mean in terms of the actions that the government is going to do to support placing students at the centre. And basically, it's about strengthening connections between international students and community, so on campus, and then the international education sector will enhance domestic and international student linkages. And then there's one point about student experience and well-being, and we know that the Australian government has, or the previous government, reaction to international students during COVID wasn't particularly praiseworthy. Basically shameful, I think, in many ways. And this is because I think largely when we start talking about international students and markets and so on, we dehumanize these individuals and these people. And I think it's really important to bring the people back into that. And then the fourth dimension of the strategy focuses on growth and global competitiveness. And then at the back of the strategy, there are 3 measures for success for the international strategy in Australia, which I think are worth also thinking about. Growth in numbers of students, growth in proportion of international students, growth in proportion of international students who are satisfied or very satisfied with studying and living in Australia. So this idea of growth being the measure of a successful internationalisation strategy. So internationalisation through growth in international students coming does create challenges for learning and teaching, but it also creates opportunities, as Betty has talked about and we've written about extensively. I think one of the things that around the professional learning is we need to provide opportunities for our academic staff to engage in different ways of thinking about the design of learning and how you engage with students and placing students at the centre rather than the course or the curriculum or the program of learning at the centre as a starting place. So many disciplines are content orientated. We've got this content, we have accreditation bodies saying we need to get through this content, we need to demonstrate to the accreditation body and employers that students have developed particular skills they can codify and demonstrate certain knowledge that they have. That's the starting place. It doesn't start with the students and thinking about them more creatively. So in the course, this postgraduate certificate course that I do, and in the work I've been doing more recently with Betty and how we've been translating this into the Latin American context, we've been applying a design thinking approach to curriculum development, which places at the front end and aligns very nicely with action research as a methodology, participatory action research, but it places at the front end empathy. Now, empathy is about understanding your user, understanding the needs of the user, understanding the context in which that user, and I'm using the word user here because that's really what they use in design thinking, but when I'm talking with my colleagues, it's about the student. So empathy with the student. So when they start to understand the rich diversity and unpacking diversity in terms of experience, not race, not culture, not language, experience, and the experience that these people bring, that shifts the thinking. The next phase then is really then thinking through a process of collaboration in alignment with the steps of a design thinking methodology. Then thinking, ideating solutions to particular problems. And the middle step between ideation and, or empathy and ideation, is defining, so understanding and problematizing what it is we're actually trying to achieve here. So what is the experience we want for our students? What is the outcome long term rather than the short term? Anyway, so I'll finish there again because there's much more we could say on this, but to affect this change, we really need processes to engage with academic staff that go beyond traditional programs of development where you come to a workshop and we throw something at you and you've got to have some sort of transformative kind of, you know, epiphany before you can engage in curriculum design. Well, no, we need different models, different ways to encourage them to think differently about what they do. And a design approach is one method of many methods that could be done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Craig Whitsitt. This was really enlightening to hear the kind of work that you're doing, bringing students' experiences at the center, and empathy as the focal point for professional learning for teachers to deal with the context of diversity that the international students bring in. I think there's a lot to learn, and maybe there's room for a lot of collaboration for teacher professional development, faculty professional development at the higher education level. And at this stage, I would really request you all to think in terms of ways that India and Australia can probably collaborate in terms of research, professional development and learning of faculty. If you can share briefly some of your thoughts before we move into addressing some of the audience questions. I'm sure our Australia-India Institute hosts have received some audience questions. But before we get to that, if you could briefly brainstorm and think about some ways that India and Australia can collaborate.
Well, I'm undertaking a very large systematic literature review using bibliometrics. I'm looking at academic papers published over a quarter of a century on higher education and internationalisation. And what I note there is the very limited number of papers that have come out of the global south, and in particular India and Latin America, that speak to a range of concepts that we don't normally talk about in the literature that we've been producing over that time, particularly in relation to internationalisation of the curriculum. And I think Betty's been doing some really important work around principles related to internationalising the curriculum, where we need to hear, well, she's advancing, I agree, because we've been working together, the importance of engaging more with the voices of the Global South. So, for example, I'll just mention cognitive justice and decolonisation as two sorts of areas that we could engage more with. And the work that we were doing with Brazil and our colleagues there was to look at, you know, the ways in which we can adapt and contextualise Betty's framework for internationalising the curriculum, such that it spoke more clear, well, it resonated more with people in those Latin American contexts. And I think, Betty, you might want to add to that.
Well, I mean, as you were speaking, I was thinking that we could also look at one perhaps very practical way of doing what you're suggesting would be to think about just as some collaborative projects that engage Indian researchers and teachers with companion researchers and teachers in Australian institutions with a shared interest in each other's disciplinary professional areas, where they start to get their students involved in collaborative projects. And so you start to have quite a rich environment. Would be a form of collaborative online international learning that has a framework that you combine with an internationalisation of the curriculum framework, where one of the outcomes of that program, COIL is generally spoken about in terms of student outcomes, but looking at how you can get professional learning for academic staff and teachers through their engagement in through their engagement in developing collaborative online international learning projects with their students, but having that facilitated in some way, or having that approached in some way as both a professional learning and a student learning opportunity. That also and another related project. So that's at a very practical level within classrooms or within programs. But the other would be to take the project in a way that we did in Latin America, that Craig and a Brazilian colleague led. I simply acted as an advisor to that project. What they did was they worked together to take existing frameworks and to test them in Latin American context, and to see whether they applied. So that led to a whole lot of conversations within that team around what it was to take something from the global north and move it into the global south. How did it apply? What did we learn from that? We learned about the importance of this boundary work, of working ourselves across boundaries. So I think we need to start pushing ourselves more to engage more in the sort of way that we're engaging today, but also in a deeper, longer way. This is about longer term partnerships and relationships that are all around learning and progressing in the field.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Betty. I think you have wonderfully addressed one of the audience questions, which really talks about cultural sensitization that is required in terms of, bringing in marginalized experiences also into consideration when you're thinking about curriculum, when you're thinking about professional learning, so that it doesn't homogenize identity, doesn't look at the student body as a homogeneous body. But there are a few more questions which I think we don't have too much time. We are almost at the end of the session, but a couple of questions. If anybody, I'm throwing these questions. Anybody?
Professor Mousumi, Professor Mousumi, do I have time to come in
Yes.
for 1 minute on those research areas? If we have the time.
Okay, please quickly. I don't know if we can extend a little beyond the time limit, because I can see quite a few questions, audience questions. But please go ahead, Dr.
Then let's go on. Let's take the audience questions first.
Okay, with regards to audience question, the one question very important regarding student flow and mobility, Professor Varghese, what could be done to encourage more student flow and mobility from the developed world context to the global south? This is very important. What could be done to motivate student mobility into global south? What do you think? What are your ideas? If you can share, particularly students from more economically developed countries.
First, let me say that, let me make two small points regarding flow of students between Australia and India. Then I'll come to this question. First, I don't think that there will be any decline in the student flow from India to Australia. So far as post-study visas in Australia, those equip students to get employment are liberal, continue to be liberal. Because we had a bad experience in 2009-10, when the Prime Minister at that point of time, Julia Gillard, tried to restrict this post-study visa, and we found a sudden decline in the number of Indian students going to Australia. That is one. But the caution today is that now Australia has taken a position that the students from 6 states in India, they will not be given visa to study. But that is, employment is not the reason. There are some fraudulent practices which are suspected, which is to be proved. So even with that, these 6 states, I don't want to name any of the Indian states in the public forum, but I feel that the student flow will continue. Secondly, the institutional flow from Australia to India will continue. As I mentioned, Deakin University is already starting. Other universities will be coming. And I am also a board member in the international board in Dubai, international city. And I also find that there are a large number of Australian institutions coming. Now, the foreign students coming to the developing world, that flow is slightly slow. I think this flow has increased to China and also to India marginally. One of the reasons is that if you say, for example, in the employment market, if you have a degree from UK, you have a good advantage to be recruited in UK. But if you have an experience in China and India, which has the largest market for multinational corporations, you are getting a better advantage, a premium in the labor market. So therefore, it will decide on that. If you are talking about students from other countries, India has to change its employment policy. India has to change its post-study visa policies. India is cheap in terms of education and fees. India is cheap in terms of the living cost. But at the same time, those who are coming to India, if they want to stay here for employment opportunities, it is not attractive. And my feeling is that the foreign students will come to India, especially from the developed world, if and only if, when you consider that the premium for their experience in India and China, countries like that, which are having large markets, are maximized or gets a good premium in the labor market for recruitment, So it is not a question of visa issue. It is more a question of what are the benefits I get by going to education in India. This is also a case you find in many cases. Say, for example, Indians going to study in China, or the Ukraine war period, when Indians were there, 18,000 students were to come back. These are the students who are not looking for post-study visa, but the students who are going to Australia are looking for post-study visa, because these students in China or in many of these East European countries, they do not want to stay there. Once they finish the studies, they take the flight back on the same day. So there is a difference, substantial difference in the way in which the market is organizing the process of mobility. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Varghese. This directly connects with one of the audience question with regards to employment. How can internationalization of higher education address the rampant underemployment of international graduates in Australia, where 1 in 4 migrants work jobs below their skill level? How can higher education improve linkage with industry for better placement? Would one of the Australian panelists like to address this question quickly before we wrap up?
It's a very hard question to address, I think. I think certainly to address in kind of a 30 seconds or a minute. But I think that what Australian institutions have been trying to do for some time, the ones I've been working in, is build stronger linkages with employers and with industry so that they value the diverse skills that international students who have an Australian degree bring to the workplace. But I think that's got to be done outside of institutions as well. This has to be a whole of government approach to really kind of selling and marketing the benefits of having such diversity in your environment. The Victorian government, for example, I know has done quite a lot of work in this area, and they had a wonderful seminar last year where a number of employers, big employers, were joining in to promote the advantages of actually taking on not only graduates, but interns as they're progressing through their degrees. So some work is being done. I think it's a matter of amplifying that work. It's the same with a lot of the work that's done in international education. We do good research. It doesn't get amplified. It gets taken up on a small basis. We need to keep working at some of those good things and ensuring that they go broader and deeper as the years go by.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Betty. We have run out of time, Craig, but please go ahead quickly.
I agree with Betty.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much. And those of you who are attending this forum, thank you for attending today's forum on internationalization of higher education. I want to express my gratitude to our esteemed panel for their valuable insights. We hope that this has successfully facilitated knowledge sharing on this very important topic and will be a gateway to from both countries. And the that has been organized today is part of a series of forums in partnership with the Community of Associate Deans Research in Education, Melbourne Graduate School of Education, Zakir Hussain Center for Educational Studies, National Institute of Educational Planning and Administration, Symbiosis International University, and supported by the Australian Government Department of Education. Today's session has been recorded and will be made available on the Australia-India Institute's website. I encourage you to visit the website and register for future forums. We also will also be distributing a post-webinar survey. So those of you who are attending this forum, please, we greatly value your participation please take the survey and let us know in what way we could further improve these forums. With that, I would like to say once again, thank you to all the panelists and all those who are attending this session. Thank you from my side. Namaste and goodbye.